Now, all right, so it sounds like you came upon this and it was already an established science.
Yeah.
So what is the origins of hand analysis?
Well, as I mentioned, the International Institute of Hand Analysis, Richard Unger was the founder, and back in the late 70s, he kind of became interested in ancient palmistry, and there are thousands of years of tradition of ancient palmistry. Some of them are predictive, some of them non-predictive. He didn't want to go for the predictive type, but he studied and studied and studied, and he said, this is great. You know, palmistry is really interesting, and I think it's valid. And he's a brilliant guy. He took the best of the best, what he thought of the ancient palmistry traditions. He said, but what about the fingerprints?
Oh, yeah.
You know, what do we know about the fingerprints? They're unique to us.
To everyone.
Yeah, and they never change. They're indelibly imprinted 5 months before you're born. And he said, well, you know, some of the Western palmists had tried to look at fingerprints and come up with a theory, but he said, I'm going to go to the forensic libraries, I'm going to go to the medical libraries, and he came up with a theory about what fingerprints might mean, because they're a kind of imprint for us.
And did he apply the theory again to sort of the old palmistry that he was looking at when he was developing it?
Well, they're different because fingerprints are separate from everything else in the palms. So it really is what this is the marriage of the ancient art of palmistry, or feeling the best traditions, and the science of contemporary fingerprint analysis.
Now is and then just kind of going back a little bit, is palmistry something that is cross-cultural? I mean, is it something that comes from several different parts of the world in ancient cultures, or is it specific to a particular region?
No, absolutely. I think it came from Asian region, and then it began to spread out into different parts, India, different parts of Asia, and then headed to Europe, and U.S. was a very late adopters.
Yes, no, that makes sense.
Right.
The Western world has been slow to adopt most forms of Eastern medicine.
Well, when I lived in California, I was privileged to read for lots of different cultures, and you know, most of them said, "Oh, my parents used to take me." I mean, very common, very well known, and even in Europe, it's much more accepted. So
now, I know just from my experience, I know that there is two other forms in Eastern medicine. There's the cranial. There's cranial analysis, and there's also foot analysis.
Yes. Yep.
And now, are they similar in their discipline, or are they different?
You know, I can't answer that. I think I would go back to hands, and that people say, well, why hands? Why don't you do feet, or why don't you do something else? And I wish I'd brought my little picture, because there's a creature called the homunculus. Some of you practitioners out there will know what it is.
Homunculus?
Homunculus,
It sounds like a Dr. Seuss creature.
And it actually is. It's a creature that is proportionally shaped based on the amount of information that comes from the brain down into the body, neural pathways, you know, communication back and forth. And not a trick question, Mariah, what do you think is relatively the biggest part of the body then, in terms of information from the brain and back?
The spinal column would be.
It's not a trick question. The hands.
Okay, well, I should have known that, right? That should be my default answer for the rest of the interview.
Right. And of course the mouth is pretty darn big. The mouth is actually really big, because we're translating. You know, we don't translate much with our feet, right? We don't translate much with our cranial, with our head. So I said, you know, there's a lot of information there. I'm going for hands.
Well, we do things with our hands.
Yeah.
And there's
Very
communicative power
expressive.
to it. You definitely move your hands when you talk to people, to gesturing.
Right.
Universal gestures, too. There's a great study on how there's universal things that people do with their hands across any language in the world.
That people know.
That everybody knows. Yeah. And they start doing when they're babies. It's amazing.
I think my next iteration is I'm going to learn sign language, because I love that. Yeah.
That would be appropriate.
Yes.
So now that we know where it came from, I guess my next question is, how is hand analysis scientific?
Yeah, good question. I'll say about the ancient palmistry traditions, the non-predictive, there are many different traditions. So I'll have people come to me and say, yeah, but what about this and what about that? And I say, well, that's not really what we look at in our system. So how that part is scientific is that we have been trained consistently to use the system and apply it over and over and over in a consistent, duplicatable way.
Yes.
Now, the fingerprints are another story because Richard came up, this is Richard Unger, came up with a theory after all his research about what the fingerprints might mean and which fingerprint happens to show up on which finger. And he started to apply that information. And 50,000 pairs of hands later, and now hundreds of thousands of pairs of hands, fingerprints, excuse me, later, we've applied and tested his theory. And in a consistent way, because we've been trained in best practices in terms of how to use this information. So it is applied research, basically.
Okay. So you are using the scientific method,
right?
And a pool of cumulative research in order to draw your conclusions.
Exactly.